If you listen to the hum beneath the second half of the 20th century, not the speeches, not the missiles, not the parades of troops marching across concrete squares, but the quieter frequency that vibrated beneath it all, you will hear the sound of two economic systems straining against each other with the intensity of tectonic plates. The Cold War was never just a contest of weapons or ideology. It was a duel of economic visions, a test of which model could feed its people, mobilize its industries, inspire its citizens, and outlast the other across decades of tension. From the ruins of World War II emerged two giants standing on opposite sides of history. The United States, steward of an ascendant capitalist order built on markets, innovation, and consumer prosperity, and the Soviet Union, guardian of a centralized command economy dedicated to planning, collectivism, and the triumph of the state over the individual. And the world shattered, rebuilding, desperate for a path forward, found itself caught between these two gravitational forces. In the United States, capitalism emerged from the war stronger than ever. American factories, spared from wartime destruction, roared into peacetime production with unprecedented capacity. The GI Bill fueled education and home ownership. Suburbs stretched outward like concrete vines. Automobiles multiplied. Refrigerators, washing machines, and televisions poured into homes as if the future itself were being delivered appliance by appliance. To walk through an American city in 1955 was to witness abundance becoming a way of life. Capitalism had found a formula for legitimacy. Prosperity translated into political power. But capitalism's Cold War strength came not merely from consumption. It came from flexibility. Markets absorbed shocks, businesses adapted, entrepreneurs experimented. The U.S. government intervened when needed, funding research, protecting industries, constructing highways, fueling innovation through defense spending. Yet it always maintained the illusion of free enterprise, the belief that the private sector was the engine of national destiny. And beneath this engine lay an unspoken truth. The Cold War was as much an economic competition as a military one. And every product invented, every suburb constructed, every Fortune 500 company that rose became a subtle bulletin to the world that capitalism could deliver not just goods, but dreams. The Soviet Union offered a starkly different promise. Emerging from the war with cities burned, millions dead, and infrastructure in ruins, the USSR turned to what it believed was its greatest strength: centralized planning. The state would command the economy like a general commanding armies. 5-year plans dictated production quotas for steel, coal, tractors, and tanks. Resources flowed not according to markets, but according to ideology. In the Soviet imagination, capitalism was chaos, wasteful, exploitative, undisciplined. Communism, by contrast, was order, rationality, and justice. Its legitimacy came not from consumer goods, but from the triumph of collective effort. And in the early decades, command planning worked, at least on the surface. The Soviet Union industrialized at breakneck speed. Space triumphs dazzled the world, culminating in the launch of Sputnik in 1957, a moment that shook American confidence to its core. Soviet factories produced machinery in staggering quantities. Military spending surged, challenging the West. To many newly independent nations emerging from colonial rule, the Soviet model appeared efficient, bold, and appealing. It promised rapid development without the volatility of markets or the inequalities of capitalism. Yet beneath this ambition lay cracks. For a planned economy to function, information must flow upward honestly, and decisions must flow downward effectively. But in the Soviet Union, information became distorted by fear, bureaucracy, and political pressure. Factory managers padded numbers to meet unrealistic quotas. Goods were produced without regard for demand. Agriculture suffered under collectivization, shortages became routine, and while the Soviet state excelled at building rockets, it struggled to supply meat, shoes, or reliable household appliances. The irony was almost cinematic. A nation capable of touching the stars could not consistently stock its grocery shelves. Meanwhile, the Cold War economy widened into a global contest. The United States marshaled its resources through alliances, aid packages, and institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Western Europe rebuilt through the Marshall Plan, forming a capitalist bloc whose strength grew through integration and trade. Japan executed an economic miracle through export-driven growth. South Korea and Taiwan followed similar paths. Capitalism became not merely an ideology, but a system of interconnected markets, supply chains, and currencies. Dollar dominance, secured after Bretton Woods and reinforced through global trade, gave the United States extraordinary financial leverage, another quiet weapon in the Cold War arsenal. The Soviet Union countered through Comcon, offering economic cooperation to Eastern Bloc nations. But cooperation without efficiency and solidarity without accountability produced stagnation. Satellite states remained dependent on Moscow for energy and raw materials. Innovation lagged, black markets grew. As the 1,960 seconds and 1,970 seconds unfolded, the Soviet model revealed a fatal weakness. Without competition, there was no incentive to improve. Without profit, there was no mechanism to allocate resources effectively. Without consumer choice, there was no feedback loop connecting supply to need. Still, neither side remained static. The U.S. economy faced its own crises: inflation, oil shocks, rising inequality, and yet each time, capitalism adapted. When manufacturing faltered, services rose. When inflation spiked, monetary policy evolved. When global competition intensified, technology and finance emerged as new engines of growth. Capitalism mutated like a living organism, shedding old skin and growing new limbs. The Soviet economy, by contrast, calcified. Central planning became ritual rather than strategy. Corruption seeped through ministries. The arms race drained resources that might have revitalized industry or agriculture. And while capitalism rewarded risk, the Soviet system punished deviation. Brilliant scientists became trapped in bureaucracy. Innovation suffocated before reaching production. The black market became the only place where supply and demand met with honesty. By the 1,980 seconds, the economic duel reached its climax. The United States, under Reagan, accelerated military spending and leaned into its technological strengths. The Soviet Union, under Brezhnev and then Andropov, strained to keep pace but found its foundation cracking. Growth slowed to a crawl. Oil revenues, the USSR's lifeblood, fell sharply. Shortages deepened. Lines for bread, meat, and clothing stretched around blocks. A society that had once championed sacrifice now faced exhaustion. It was into this exhaustion that Mikhail Gorbachev entered, attempting reforms, perestroika, glasnost that sought to revitalize the system without abandoning it. But the reforms loosened the threads holding the command economy together, exposing decades of inefficiency. Economic liberalization without market structures only created confusion. Political openness without economic stability ignited discontent. The Cold War economy, after decades of tension, finally approached its breaking point, a point that would soon unravel the Soviet Union itself, ending an era in which two economic visions had battled for the soul of the modern world, a battle whose consequences would K8 Lij Taichin Danoi, reverberate far beyond the fall of the Berlin Wall, shaping not only the geopolitical order, but the very DNA of the global economy that emerged in its aftermath. For when the Cold War's economic struggle finally reached its end, it did not conclude with a treaty or a negotiated settlement. It concluded with an implosion, the quiet collapse of a system that had spent decades resisting the gravitational pull of market forces, only to find itself unable to escape them in the end. The Soviet Union did not die in a single moment. It unraveled thread by thread as the contradictions that had accumulated across generations finally snapped. By the late 1,980 seconds, the Soviet economic machine no longer simply struggled, it seized. Factories ran without spare parts, producing goods no one wanted. Agricultural output stagnated despite endless campaigns and slogans. Oil production, once the empire's financial lifeline, faltered. And the state, which had promised abundance through central planning, could offer only cues, rationing, and a vocabulary of explanations that had grown hollow from overuse. Gorbachev, in attempting to reform the system, inadvertently revealed its structural rot. Glasnost exposed truths long hidden. Perestroika loosened controls the system relied on for survival. What remained was a landscape where hope surged but institutions failed to support it, a paradox that pushed the Soviet economy toward collapse with increasing speed. Meanwhile, capitalism, for all its flaws, displayed a kind of restless adaptability that command economies could not match. The US, Western Europe, Japan, and the newly industrializing economies of East Asia embraced technology, finance, and global trade. Supply chains stretched across continents. Currency markets deepened, innovation accelerated, and in this dynamic ecosystem, the Soviet economy looked less like an alternative model and more like an artifact of a vanished age. The final blow came not through ideology, but arithmetic. The USSR could no longer afford the Cold War. Its share of global GDP had shrunk. Its military burden had grown. Its consumer goods sector stagnated. And its people, newly aware of the prosperity beyond their borders, began demanding not sacrifice, but dignity. Gorbachev faced a truth earlier leaders had refused to acknowledge. The command economy had exhausted itself. No amount of propaganda or planning could compensate for its inefficiencies. And so, as republics asserted independence and markets faintly began to appear, the Soviet Union dissolved, not defeated militarily, but overrun by the realities of economic gravity. When the red flag came down on the 25th of December 1991, it marked not only the end of a superpower, but the end of a 70-year experiment in central planning. The Cold War's economic duel had a clear victor, not capitalism in its purest form, but capitalism as an adaptive system capable of learning, mutating, and reinventing itself in response to pressures that would have shattered a more rigid structure. The world entered the 1,990 seconds believing perhaps too confidently that markets had triumphed, that the future belonged to globalization, deregulation, and the borderless flow of capital. Suddenly, nations that had once been locked behind the Iron Curtain faced the shock of transition. Russia plunged into chaotic privatization vouchers, oligarchs, collapsing industries, hyperinflation, and a new class of magnates who acquired factories and oil fields for pennies on the dollar. Eastern Europe experienced its own upheavals. Unemployment soared, subsidies vanished, currencies destabilized. It was capitalism without safety nets, reform without sequencing, liberation without preparation. Some nations weathered the storm, others never fully recovered. The Cold War had ended, but the economic trauma of its collapse carved deep scars across the former Soviet sphere. Meanwhile, capitalism, now largely unopposed, entered a period of confident expansion. The 1,990 seconds saw the acceleration of trends seeded during the Cold War, the triumph of the US. If you 2-1, dollar, the rise of multinational corporations, the explosive growth of financial markets, the birth of the internet, and the belief that free markets could solve nearly any problem if given enough time and liquidity. Institutions created after Bretton Woods evolved into the stewards of globalization. Supply chains stretched into China, whose hybrid model of state-directed capitalism would soon become one of the most consequential economic transformations in history. The world economy began to spin faster, interconnected in ways unimaginable during the era of containment. Yet, the legacy of the Cold War economy was not simply victory and defeat, it was the creation of a global order defined by competition, innovation, and vulnerability. Capitalism had won, but victory carried its own burdens. With no ideological rival to restrain it, markets drifted toward excesses that would later erupt in crises. The dot-com bubble, the 2008 financial collapse, the rise of inequality, and the geopolitical tensions emerging from a world where economic interdependence did not guarantee political harmony. The ghost of the Soviet collapse also haunted Russia's future, shaping its politics, its resentments, and its ambitions as it clawed its way back onto the global stage, fueled by oil revenues and nostalgia for lost influence. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Cold War economy is the reminder that economic systems are not judged solely by output or productivity, they are judged by resilience. Capitalism proved resilient because it could fail, learn, and adapt. Communism, by design, could not. It required perfection in execution, honesty in reporting, and obedience in implementation conditions no human society can sustain indefinitely. In the end, The Cold War was not just a contest of ideology, but a test of which system could absorb the shocks of modernity without collapsing under them. And so, when we look back at the Cold War economy, what we see is not merely the rivalry of two superpowers, but a vast, slow motion stress test of human organization. Two competing answers to the same ancient question: how should a society allocate resources, motivate people, and distribute power? Capitalism answered through markets. Communism answered through commands. History rendered its verdict not in slogans but in outcomes, outcomes visible in the prosperity of one system and the implosion of the other. If this journey through the economic battlefield of the Cold War sparked a new perspective, if a moment, an idea, or a theme suddenly felt illuminated, share what resonated most. And if you'd like to continue exploring the deep, cinematic currents of financial history that still shape our world, follow the channel so you never miss the next chapter.